Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name's Gretchen and today I am here with another reading recap. So it hasn't been terribly long since I last caught you up on the books that I have finished, but I'm trying to get on a cadence of maybe doing these recaps maybe once every 2 weeks or so that the books are more fresh in my mind when I sit down to do these videos, and also so they're not as long as they typically are. I know that sometimes I'm reading sometimes 10 books, sometimes 12 in a month, and I know that those videos can be pretty long. So this will maybe help me retain more information about the books and get them out to you while I still really have a good memory of what I read. And then also, it's just more consistent content in smaller, more digestible pieces. The first book that I want to talk about is Anita de Monte Laughs Last by Xochitl Gonzalez, and this was published in 2024. Now, this is a book that I had been meaning to get to, but thankfully it was longlisted for the Aspen Words Literary Prize. If you've been following my channel, you'll know that I'm trying to get through the entirety of that long list, so this was just the perfect excuse to finally pick this book up. Now, before we get into the plot of the book, I want to start by saying that this book is based on the life of a real person. Her name was Ana Mendieta, and she was a Cuban-American artist. She was a performance artist, sculptor, painter, and that's going to be important when I get toward the end of the review and after we talk about what this book is, but keep that in mind. So this book does have multiple viewpoints. We have a perspective from Anita de Monte, we have her husband Jack, and then we also have another character. Her name is Rachel. There's also two timelines that we're working with. We have 1985 New York City with Anita and Jack, and then we have Rachel, who is a student at Brown, so Providence, Rhode Island, in 1998. Now, the story opens with us learning a little bit about Anita, and we're learning it from her perspective. She is an up-and-coming artist, and she's finally starting to get some traction in the art world, and people are really starting to pay attention to what she is doing. She is also in love. We learn a little bit about the evolution of her relationship with Jack, her now husband, and how they fell in love and how they got to where they were. Jack is also an artist, and we have that kind of stereotype sometimes where you have two artists that are, you know, competing, and we start to see little fissures start to develop in their relationship as Anita is starting to get her time to shine and her art is getting to be the focus, and Jack is starting to go by the wayside, and that's not really sitting very well with him. One of the incidents that happens at the beginning of the story is they are at a party, and it's a public party. Well, public in the sense that there are a bunch of people there, and they are clearly having an argument in front of this group of people. Then the next thing we know, they are alone in their apartment, which is 30 stories high, and we're seeing them have this heated argument, and ultimately it ends with Jack clearly pushing Anita out of that 30-story window and her ultimately falling to her death. And then after that, Anita remains as a character throughout the book, but she is doing it as a ghost, and we're seeing her perspective of what is happening as Jack is accused of her killing, and him going through the process of being accused, him being on trial, etc., all of that. She is a part of that, and she is seeing all of this. And then we have this other timeline where we have Rachel, who is an art history student at Brown, and she is kind of having a very similar path or parallel life to Anita in some way. She's an art history student. She is from Puerto Rico, and she is the minority at her school, and she's really trying to make a name for herself in her program, but she feels like she has to work a little harder than everybody else because not only is she a woman, but she is also Puerto Rican, and she ends up crossing paths with an up-and-coming artist that comes from a very wealthy family, and she ends up in this relationship with him. And as the story starts to progress, we start to really see those similarities of her light kind of being snuffed out by this man that can't stand or appreciate the fact that she does have talent, and she is more than just a minority and more than just a token girlfriend for him to have on his arm. And the way that the story then develops is we eventually get to the point where Anita's narrative from the grave aligns with Rachel's, and I don't want to give more away than that because I think that the way that all of that happens, I think it was done really well, and it was overall a pretty enjoyable story. It was very unique. It wasn't like anything that I have read before, but I know that this is not going to be a story for everybody. First and foremost, I did mention that Anita is a ghost throughout the majority of the book, and the way that she's not a quiet ghost either. She's not just observing, she is actually manipulating things in the world, and she is definitely making her presence known. And I know that some readers are just not going to gel with any type of elements of you know, ghosts or the supernatural or any type of magical realism elements within a book. One thing I really did love about the story is how quickly we just jumped into the meat of the story. The author really didn't give us time to acclimate to anything or learn much about the story before we knew exactly what had happened to Anita, and we knew very quickly that the rest of the story was going to be from that perspective of the ghost. It wasn't something that we had to wait a really long time to find out, which I appreciated. Let's just jump right in and get to the meat of the story. I really liked the way that Gonzalez also aligned the path of Rachel and Anita. There were a lot of little clues along the way about how it would happen, but Rachel truly was her own character throughout the majority of the book. She had a very substantial plot line. We got to learn all about her time at school, her friends, her family, and we really got to know who she was as a person, and we had time to know Rachel as a character and have her develop along the way. She just wasn't an afterthought. Gonzalez was very intentional about all of the paths that Rachel took to get her to that point where their stories would merge. And I really appreciated that because it felt seamless. It didn't feel forced, in my opinion. And I thought that that part was done very well. I also really liked the fact that even though Anita and Rachel's paths were similar, they weren't exact. It wasn't Gonzalez telling us the same story twice. There were similarities there, and the foundation was there. You had this very strong Latina woman that was very smart and very capable and very talented, but you had this white man that was trying to hold her back, and this white man was extremely toxic, but it wasn't necessarily in the same exact way. It wasn't cookie cutter, which I appreciated. I sometimes don't like books like that because the similarities just seem so coincidental and forced, but the way that Gonzalez did it, I felt like they were different enough but similar enough to make the reader understand exactly what was happening. And then the last thing I will say about my general experience with the book is that you may know I also like to listen to the audio as I read the physical copy, and the voice actress that did Anita, oh, she did such an amazing job. It was fantastic. Her passion came through, and the energy that she put into that character was palpable, and it was such an enjoyable listening experience. Now, all things considered, taking into my level of enjoyment of the story and my overall experience with it, if this story were truly the invention of the author and it was hatched directly from their mind and it took no outside inspiration from a real life person, I could have easily given this book 4.5 stars. But unfortunately, this book is always going to have an asterisk next to it for me, because after reading this book, I learned that Ana Mendieta, who was the inspiration for this book, her family was not happy with the way that Anna was portrayed, or Anita portrayed Anna in this book. They felt that the book focused more on her death, and they really felt that Anna would have wanted her legacy to be more about her art and have that be in the forefront of the story, whereas the book truly did focus more on her death and the incident that took her away from her family. And I totally get that, and I can absolutely respect that. So I just wanted to make sure that you were all aware of that in case this is a book that you decided you wanted to pick up. And at the end of the day, I want to believe that the author had good intentions and that her heart was in the right place, but I do really wish that she would have taken the appropriate actions to make sure that the family was on board. Moving on to my next read, I have a book that's been on my TBR for way too long, and now that I have read it, I'm kicking myself because this turned out to be my first 5-star read of 2025, and that is Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. This book, I'm not going to tell anybody anything that they haven't already heard of about this book. I feel like I'm probably one of the last few people that is picking this one up, and I can understand now why this book is talked about with such admiration across all of the bookish platforms. This book is fantastic. The storytelling is fantastic. The prose is stunning, and it just has such an effortlessness to it. I honestly don't know how Maggie O'Farrell does it. I was actually in awe as I was reading this book, thinking, how on earth can someone be as talented as Maggie O'Farrell is as a writer? So Hamnet is the son of William Shakespeare. Although Shakespeare's name is never mentioned throughout the duration of this book, we know for obvious reasons that it is him. And the book opens with Hamnet trying to find help for his twin sister who has taken ill. Now keep in mind, the subtitle of this is that it's Hamnet, a novel of the plague. So the plague is running rampant. We're in the 1580s and things are not, looking good. So she gets sick. Hamnet's scrambling to find somebody to help her. And then the story, as he's trying to find someone, we start to learn bits and pieces about other members of his family. We start to learn about his mother, Agnes. We start to learn about his grandfather. And then we ultimately learn about the relationship of how Agnes and Shakespeare got together and their love story, and then the point where we're back to present day and we have this child that is ill. Ultimately, it is not Joanne that passes. It ends up being Hamnet, and then the rest of the story is basically talking about how this family is coping through the grief of losing a child and a brother. And it is such a beautiful story. And I know that the book is called Hamnet, but honestly, my takeaway from this story is that Hamnet is just kind of the catalyst of the story, but it also, like I said, focuses on that love story. We learn how Agnes and William got together and how they got to where they were, and then how William's career started, how he started going to London. He was originally a glove maker, and he was making gloves for the theater troops in London. And then you have Agnes, who is this fierce woman who is kind of like the town, almost like witch. She's into herbs and she's into medicine and she's a healer, and learning how the town and the rest of the community perceives her and her family. And it's just so interesting. And it's not a story, like I said, that fully focuses on Hamnet, but once he passes and the story starts to talk about the journey that that family takes through their grief, oh my gosh, it's just, it's beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful, and it is done in such a soft and gentle way, and the way that Maggie O'Farrell is able to extract those emotions out of you as the reader, it's almost like you're under a spell when you're reading Maggie O'Farrell's writing. It is something. It's just truly impressive. If I could only pick one takeaway from my reading experience with this, I think I would say that it was the way that I was completely able to shut the outside world off around me as I read this. I try to find pockets of time throughout the day to read, and sometimes I have to set an alarm to make sure that I get back to the task at hand and I don't spend too much time reading. And there was one time that I had an alarm set while I was reading this, and it was literally going off for about 3 minutes before I even realized that there was an alarm ringing next to my head. I was so deeply engrossed into this book. It was just such an incredible experience to be able to fully just engage in that world and see everything that was going on around me and hear the voices. And yeah, it was just such an incredible reading experience. And because of that, I would absolutely love to see this as an adaptation. I'm not saying that there's plans for it. I've never heard of there being any plans for it, but I would love to see this play out on screen. I think that if you got the right director and the right actors, that it could be a fantastic adaptation. And then, yeah, the last thing I'll say about this is I don't think that I will ever turn away a Maggie O'Farrell book. I know that she has some more in her backlist. I've read The Marriage Portrait and I've read this. I know she has some. I believe she also did a memoir as well that I will have to pick up as well. And anytime in the future that I see a new Maggie O'Farrell, I will be the first in line to pick it up. I literally think that this woman could write a story about someone prepping for a colonoscopy and it would be the most beautiful story that I've ever read. So yeah, if you haven't read this, please do yourself a favor. And yeah, I don't think that you will regret it. All right, the next book is another one that I've been meaning to get to for a while, and that is Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt, and this was published in 2022. So this book follows our main character, Tova, and Tova is in her late 60s, early 70s, I believe, and Tova's had a pretty sad life. She lost her son 30 years ago. He mysteriously vanished, was presumed dead, and she recently lost her husband, Will. So she's not only been grieving for her son for 30 years, but now she has that added layer of grieving for her husband. She tries to keep her life busy. She has a group of friends that she sees frequently, and she also works at the local aquarium as the housekeeper. So she spends a lot of time in this aquarium, and she mops around all of the tanks, and she's constantly surrounded by all of these unique sea creatures. And Tova's lonely, so sometimes when she's there, she'll talk to them and she'll interact with them, and she kind of befriends this giant Pacific octopus, and his name is Marcellus, and he is also a character in this book as well. So the story is told from Tova's perspective, but we also have chapters or pieces of the book that are narrated by Marcellus, and Marcellus is a bit of a grump. He is basically doing like a log of his life. He understands that he is a giant Pacific octopus and he understands what his lifespan is. He has been in captivity, not his entire life, but the majority of his life, and he knows that he is a certain age and that, you know, his species only lives for a certain amount of time, and he is kind of getting to the point where he is just counting down to the days of his death, thinking that he will be in captivity for the duration of that time. He's also kind of like a little bit of a trickster. He frequently escapes the tank, and him and Tova kind of have like this bond where she knows what he's up to, and she tries to keep his secret because she has obviously developed this friendship and connection with him. And I had mentioned those things about Tova's past life. She is really trying to find peace with everything that happens, but there is also something that Marcellus knows that he is trying to communicate to Tova and trying to get her to understand. And then we have another character named Cameron. Cameron is from California. He is struggling with life as well, and he's really trying to find his purpose in life. He can't hold down a job. He can't hold down relationships. He never really knew his family. He doesn't know who his father is. He never met him, and he's really trying to find some stability in his life. So he decides that he is going to go on this quest to get more information about his father. There is something that falls into his lap as far as a clue goes, and he decides to run with it, and it takes him to the same town that all of the where the aquarium is. And the rest of the story is basically just these two characters as well as the octopus just trying to find their way. So this was definitely a feel-good read for me. It was heartwarming and wholesome. I don't think it was overly sentimental either. It definitely had its moments, but it wasn't super saccharine, sappy sweet to me, which I really appreciated. I think the standout for this book for me was Marcellus as a character. I know that some people have issue with animals having a voice. Now, he didn't actually talk. We were just getting his inner dialogue, but I know that some people don't like that, but I found it to be very charming. I read the physical and listen to the audio for this one, and Michael Urie does the voice of Marcellus, and he is just that perfect amount of curmudgeon, and I absolutely loved it, and it really stole the show for me. As far as the writing goes, it was just average for me. I don't think that it's going to be anything that's going to blow anybody away, but what I will call out specifically is, and I actually want to get a petition to get authors to stop using this phrase, but every time I hear someone say in a book, "I was holding a breath I didn't even realize I was holding," it immediately knocks the book down a peg or two. It immediately takes something from being potentially literary to something being commercial, and this book had at least 3 instances of that in it, and the first time I will let it slide, the second time I'm starting to cringe, and the third time you've just lost a star. Other than that, it was an enjoyable read, and I definitely understand why people like this book, and yeah, I would definitely recommend it if you're looking for something wholesome and heartfelt and something that is also going to give you a good story too. So last but not least, the final book that I finished was Passiontide by Monique Roffey, and this was published in 2024. This is another book that's based on a true story. In 2016, there was a Japanese woman by the name of Asimi Nagakiya. She was a steel pan drum player that was traveling to Trinidad and Tobago for carnival to play the drums, and she was brutally murdered. So the book takes place on a fictional island though, and we have our victim who is a Japanese steel pan player, like the true story, and the book opens at the end of Carnival going into the start of the holy period of Lent. Now, when the victim is found, we very quickly start the police investigation, and we're following Lovejoy, who is the police officer in charge of the investigation. And as things start to come to light and we're starting to learn things, it becomes very evident to us as the reader that this is not an uncommon thing for the area. They call it femicide, and women are constantly falling victim to these types of crimes, whether it's sexual assault or whether it's murder as well. And then the other thing that is very disgusting that comes out is the fact that many of the men in the community believe the victim is to blame for her ultimate murder because of the costume that she was wearing, and she was basically asking for it. And obviously the women that are in the local community have a very hard time swallowing that, and they are not going to stand for it anymore. They do not feel that that is right, as they should, and they start to band together to help get justice for Sora, who is the name of the victim, as well as try to prevent anything like this happening in the community again. So we have primarily 4 women that come together. They're from all different walks of life. It goes from a local activist to a journalist. We also have the wife of the prime minister of the island, and then we also have a woman that is the leader of the sex workers collective on the island as well. So we have all of these women coming together. They're trying to rally all the other women within the community, and they basically decide that they're going to take a stand and stand up for all this violence against women. The first thing I'll say about this book is I was immediately drawn into this book. The first 50 pages of this book absolutely flew by. The writing was impeccable. The pacing was on par. It was fantastic. This is a difficult read, obviously, because of the subject matter. So know that going in. There are going to be really horrific things in detail that you're going to read about in here. But I absolutely loved that element of female rebellion. The women saying, we have had enough and we're not going to stand for this anymore. And not only that, but the reaction that the men had to the women doing that. It's not something they were expecting. They don't think highly of women, obviously, and they could never imagine that the women would weaponize their femininity against the men, and to see their reaction to that was just absolutely fantastic. I loved watching them all squirm on the pages. As far as plot goes, I absolutely loved this book. I thought that it had a fantastic plot, and the way that these women were able to come together, I thought was fantastic. I thought the author did an incredible job of not only telling the story about the murder and getting to the point where we're learning about, you know, the investigation and everything that's happening with that, but also with what the women were doing in response to that. I feel like sometimes with novels like this where you have 2 major things going on, you have that mystery, but you also have the action, and sometimes you can lose sight of one or the other, and the author was always able to keep both of them in in the forefront, which I really appreciated. The one thing that I will say that I found a little bit disappointing about this book is that if the book had stuck truly to a plot-based novel, I think that I would have loved this a lot more, because what ended up happening is after the first 50 or so pages, it seemed like the author really started to develop some of her characters, but none of them ever really seemed to be fully baked. The only one that I think really came close maybe was Gigi. She was the one that was the leader of the sex collective. I feel like we got a lot of insights into her life and what was making her tick, and I feel like she was probably the most well-developed character, but there were too many characters in this novel to have it be something that was character driven and remain under, I mean, I think this book was only around 350 pages. Yeah, so this book wasn't, you know, that long, but it was too short to be both a plot heavy and a character heavy novel for the amount of characters that we had. And I feel like if we had just spent more time just focusing on the plot, that it would have been easily a 5-star read for me. I thought that the plot was so engaging. And really, once the characters started to come into the mix, that's when things really started to slow down for me. And I think the last thing I'll say about the book is I love the way that it ended. It doesn't tie everything up in a nice bow. It gives the reader just enough hope to know that change is possible and good things can happen, but we're never going to get to the point where it's a perfect world where horrible things don't happen to women like this. And it is going to be a tough challenge, and it's going to be something that women will constantly have to work for, and knowing that the fight is worth it because you can get to a place where things are better, but don't get comfortable because things can easily be taken away. You're just constantly going to have to be in that state of fighting for your rights. So now just to talk quickly about the books I'm actively reading. I'm not going to tell you about the books, just which ones they are. I am still reading the books of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk. I am still reading War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. I'm still reading The Possessed by Witold Gombrowicz. And I recently picked up another book called The Seas by Samantha Hunt. So those are the 4 books that I am actively in the middle of. And then the 2 that I will likely start next, I'm almost done with The Seas, and hopefully I will be done with The Possessed soon. And then the next 2 books that I will be picking up after those are Fire Exit by Morgan Talty, and then Girl, Woman, Other by Bernadine Evaristo. So those are the books that are coming. There are a couple things that are going to be coming up soon that are exciting in the reading world, or at least my reading world. We have the Women's Prize for Nonfiction, and then I think the following week we have the long list for the International Booker coming up. I'm planning on doing a prediction video for what I think is going to be longlisted for the International Booker, so you have that to come. And then, yeah, things are going to be getting exciting now that we're starting to get close to all of these literary awards dropping their long lists. So the Women's Prize for Fiction will not be far behind those other 2. So it's about to get very busy as far as reading goes in my life, and probably yours as well. So until we read again, bye!